This European princess was more inbred than if her parents had been brother and sister. Let that sink in for a moment. And somehow, she was the lucky one. For centuries, Europe's royal families believed they could outsmart mortality by marrying each other. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The Habsburgs called it preserving purity. Everyone else might call it a slow-motion medical disaster. Because while they feared losing their thrones, they should have feared their family trees. From that glittering web of power and decay came Maria Antonia of Austria, the most inbred princess in European history, a girl born into a world of jewels and sickness, crowned by bloodlines that had looped too many times to count. Her inheritance was a curse disguised as destiny, her blood, both her crown and her coffin. Before you drift off, what time is it where you are? Let's see who's still awake while we talk about the slow collapse of royal DNA. And tap subscribe if you love what I do here, or you just might never come across this channel again. That's almost as tragic as the fate of the Habsburgs. Now settle in. We're heading into the marble corridors of 17th century Vienna, where no one was healthy and everyone was somehow related. If you were born a Habsburg, you didn't conquer lands. You collected relatives. For nearly 400 years, the most powerful family in Europe built their empire not with swords or ships, but with wedding vows. They didn't need wars when they could just marry the enemy's daughter, inherit the kingdom, and call it diplomacy. To them, the most dangerous weapon in the world was a marriage certificate. You can almost picture it, a grand hall filled with portraits, all royal, all regal, all suspiciously similar. Same jaw, same heavy eyelids, same pale lips, pressed into the same expression of exhausted entitlement. Every generation looked a little more like a copy of the last, until the family resemblance wasn't charming anymore. It was alarming. The Habsburgs like to say, Bella gerant ali, to Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. It sounded elegant enough at first. Why waste soldiers when you could just send out brides? But over time, this strategy became less about fortune and more about genetics roulette. You see, when most families drew a tree, the Habsburgs drew a spiral. Every branch looped back into another. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. And each generation, the bloodline got a little smaller, a little weaker, a little more haunted. It's what historians politely call pedigree collapse. When the same ancestors keep showing up again and again until you realize your great-grandfather is also your second cousin. But the Habsburgs didn't see it as collapse. They saw it as purity. To them, the royal blood was sacred, too precious to be diluted by ordinary people, which is ironic because it ended up being so pure that it could barely sustain life. Let's take a stroll through their little genealogical masterpiece, shall we? Imagine Spain in the 1500s, the mighty Charles V, the man who ruled more of the world than anyone before him, had inherited an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on it. Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, pieces of the New World, all his, thanks to centuries of calculated marriages. But Charles wasn't satisfied with land. He wanted legacy. So he did what Habsburgs did best. He married his cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their union produced Philip II of Spain, who married his cousin Maria of Portugal, and then, after she died, married his own niece, Anna of Austria. It's like the family motto had shifted from marry for peace to marry whoever's nearby. A few generations later, You have Philip IV of Spain marrying Mariana of Austria, who was his niece. Together, they produced a son, Charles II, the most infamous victim of this dynastic science experiment. A king so deformed and fragile that foreign ambassadors described him as more a shadow than a man. By the time Maria Antonia was born, this was normal. Inbreeding wasn't a scandal, it was policy, and the consequences were becoming visible. The Habsburg jaw, for instance, that long, protruding chin that made eating a royal ordeal. Portraits had to be touched up to hide it, but it only grew worse with each generation. Their teeth didn't align. Their tongues couldn't fit comfortably in their mouths. One ambassador wrote that Charles II had such difficulty chewing that his meals took hours and that he drooled constantly during council meetings. That was the royal bloodline in action, centuries of careful planning, distilled into someone who couldn't finish dinner. Then there were the stillbirths, the miscarriages, the weak heirs who never reached adulthood. These were written off as acts of God, but even God must have been raising an eyebrow by then. Behind the gilt mirrors and velvet curtains, the family line was collapsing in slow motion. Still, no one dared question the practice. The priests said divine will had chosen this family to rule. The courtiers whispered that the Habsburgs were cursed, but not loudly enough to be heard. And so, generation after generation, the weddings continued, each one a polite form of self-destruction. If you're imagining candlelit weddings filled with harps and roses, think again. These were political negotiations, contracts sealed with rings. When a Habsburg daughter married, she wasn't sent to start a family. She was sent to reinforce a border. Every bride carried with her not just a dowry, but a map, and sometimes the future of Europe itself. It worked for a while. The family ruled over empires that stretched across continents. They crowned kings, appointed popes, controlled trade, and shaped wars from behind their lace curtains. To the outside world, they looked unstoppable, but inside the palace walls, the blood was running thin. Whispers began spreading, quiet, superstitious ones, about a family curse. Servants claimed to see ghostly figures in the corridors of Madrid's Alcazar Palace, pale faces that resembled portraits long dead. In Austria, they said the empress's candle would always flicker before a birth went wrong. Physicians began to notice the patterns too, the miscarriages, the seizures, the strange deformities that couldn't be explained by chance. Of course, no one could say it aloud. To question the dynasty was treason. So instead, they whispered about demons, hexes, and God's punishment. It was easier than admitting they'd engineered their own downfall. From Spain to Vienna, the family portraits grew eerily uniform. By the mid-1600s, the Habsburgs had effectively turned themselves into their own distant cousins. Each new heir was the product of so much repetition that their genetic diversity was almost gone. One modern study later calculated that Charles II's genome was as inbred as if his parents had been siblings. And Maria Antonia's was worse. The empire, of course, went on pretending everything was fine. Lavish balls, grand processions, painted smiles. That's the strange thing about decline. It doesn't always look like ruin. Sometimes it looks like gold and velvet and the smell of dying roses. And yet, amid all that wealth, the same question lingered. How much longer could this continue? How long before divine right gave way to biology? Maria Antonia's father, Leopold I, had watched the Spanish branch of the family unravel and told himself he could do better. He couldn't. When he married his niece, Margaret Teresa of Spain, He called it a union of two great houses, but they were, in fact, the same house twice over. Their family tree didn't need another branch. It needed an exorcism. From that marriage came Maria Antonia, the endpoint of centuries of royal recycling. By her birth in 1669, the Habsburg gene pool was less a pool and more a puddle. Generations of alliances had created a dynasty so interconnected that entire kingdoms rested on the same handful of chromosomes. But in the marble halls of Vienna, no one talked about that. They celebrated her birth as a triumph. A princess of pure blood, they said, the perfect blend of Spain and Austria, unity in human form. If you'd been standing there, you might have believed it. The palace gleamed. Bells rang out across the city. Courtiers toasted to her health, though health was precisely what the Habsburgs no longer had. And so, the empire cheered for its future, unaware that it was cheering for its end. The curse didn't fall from the heavens. It wasn't whispered by witches or scribbled in prophecy. It was written, patiently, into their blood. By the time Maria Antonia came into the world, the royal bloodline was so compact you could pour it into a thimble and still have room left for all their secrets. Vienna, 1669. The bells of St. Stephen's ring through the winter air as the imperial court holds its breath. Deep inside the Hofburg palace, behind layers of marble and incense, a child has just been born. A princess, tiny, pale, fragile. Her name is Maria Antonia of Austria, and the midwives whisper that she won't live to see the week out. You wouldn't blame them for thinking that. The Habsburg family, for all its palaces and portraits, had become famous for funerals. By the time Maria Antonia opened her eyes, her family tree looked like a shrine, full of candles and very few survivors. Her mother, Margaret Teresa of Spain, had already buried 3 children by then. The first, a boy named Ferdinand, died before Maria Antonia was even born. 2 more followed, John and little Maria Anna. Each one slipped away before they'd taken 10 breaths outside the cradle. It became routine. Ministers sending condolence letters between breakfast meetings, painters quietly putting away half-finished portraits. And then came Maria Antonia. No one expected much. The priest came early, just in case. Her father, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, sent for physicians who prescribed things like powdered pearls and prayers, and somehow, impossibly, she lived. The palace celebrated, but cautiously, as if clapping too loudly might frighten her away. She was christened with enough names to fill a scroll. Maria Antonia, Josefa Benedicta, Rosalia Petronella. In true Habsburg fashion, it sounded less like a baptism and more like an apology to every saint in heaven. Her survival was considered miraculous, almost suspiciously so. Courtiers whispered that she was favored by God, though others muttered darker things, that perhaps the curse had simply decided to skip 1 generation just to make things interesting, because the signs were already there. Her mother, the Empress Margaret Teresa, was 21, but looked closer to 40. Pale, weak, and barely able to stand after childbirth, she lingered only a few years more before dying of what doctors called exhaustion, which was a polite 17th century way of saying her body gave up. When she died in 1673, she left behind not an empire, but a 4-year-old daughter surrounded by servants who spoke in whispers. The Hofburg palace grew quieter after that. Her nursery became what one courtier later described as a room of ghosts. Tiny embroidered clothes, untouched toys, the faint smell of wax and perfume. A place built for laughter, filled instead with absence. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the shuffle of maids clearing away another empty cradle, the distant toll of another morning bell. They called her the Little Miracle, but miracles are lonely things. She was the last surviving child of one of the most inbred marriages in European history, a union between an uncle and his niece. Even by royal standards, that was pushing it. Her father, Emperor Leopold, adored her, or at least the idea of her. But affection, in that world, came second to usefulness. To him, Maria Antonia was not just a child. She was a pawn, one born of sacred blood, strategically placed between empires. And so, while other children learned songs or games, she learned posture, presence, and silence. You can almost imagine it, a tiny figure wandering the echoing halls, too important to play, too fragile to run, listening to the click of her own shoes on the marble floor. The palace was her playground, but every room felt like a reminder that her family's glory had come at a cost no one dared name aloud. At meals, the air was thick with ritual. She sat straight-backed beside her father, who lectured her on duty, on God, and on the delicate balance of kingdoms. Between bites of bland bread, she learned that her worth lay not in her laughter, but in her lineage. When your family album doubles as a medical chart, you might say, that's never a good sign. Her portraits from childhood show a solemn face, dark eyes, and a tight, practiced smile. She looked less like a child and more like a small, well-dressed question mark, the living proof that the Habsburg bloodline hadn't yet completely destroyed itself. And yet, there was something remarkable about her, an intelligence that flickered through even the most formal accounts. Tutors described her as quick to learn, disciplined, and strangely self-contained. She studied Latin and French, music, and theology. Not so she could think freely, of course, but so she could be impressive when the time came to marry her off. Every hour of her education was an investment in diplomacy. Her handwriting, her singing, her posture, all quietly assessed as future tools for alliance. She was being trained not for life, but for dynasty. In her world, girls were not raised to rule. They were raised to marry men who did. Her duty was simple: look beautiful, stay obedient, and produce heirs with the right kind of jawline. Preferably not too much jawline. The irony, of course, was that Maria Antonia's face, delicate, composed, and slightly melancholy, would one day appear on propaganda portraits sent across Europe. But for now, she was just a quiet child in an enormous palace, watched by more people than she would ever be allowed to truly know. Her father remarried soon after her mother's death, twice in fact. Both of his new wives were also cousins, because at this point, why stop? The second, Claudia Felicitas of Tyrol, was kind to Maria but died within 3 years of tuberculosis. The third, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, managed to live long enough to give Leopold 10 more children. Maria's world grew crowded, half-siblings everywhere, governesses shuffling between nurseries, but none of it made her less alone. In a palace filled with people, she was still the odd one out. Too Spanish for Vienna, too Austrian for Madrid, and far too valuable to be ordinary. Sometimes, when she looked at her stepmother's portraits, she must have wondered what it was all for. All that breeding, all that praying, all that talk of divine blood. And yet one by one they withered young. Her tutors recorded that she had a quiet, steady temperament, rarely smiled, rarely cried. She spoke softly, even as a child. Maybe she learned early that being loud in a palace was dangerous. Maybe she understood that silence kept you safe. At night, as candles burned low in her nursery, she'd fall asleep beneath tapestries that showed her ancestors in their prime, crusaders, emperors, queens, all staring down from embroidered heavens. She probably didn't know yet that most of them were also her cousins. Vienna was beautiful then, cold and brilliant, a city of bells and ice. Outside the palace, winter snow fell over the cobbled streets. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and holy water. Somewhere, a musician practiced a slow violin piece, notes echoing faintly through the corridors. You can almost imagine her listening, small hands folded neatly, waiting for a mother who would never come back, and a future already written by men in other rooms. There's something haunting about a child raised in the middle of history's longest echo. Everything she touched carried memory. Every hall, every crown, every family name. She was both the proof of the dynasty's endurance and the evidence of its decay. And yet, she kept surviving. Through illnesses that swept the court, through waves of loss, through the weight of being the last of her line. Maybe that's what made her seem special to those around her. Not her titles, but the quiet defiance of simply being alive. Still, the older she grew, the more that miracle felt like a burden. Every birthday was another reminder that she was meant to become something. A wife, an heir-bearer, a treaty in human form. Childhood wasn't a stage to enjoy. It was a waiting room for obligation. Her father, always planning, began discussing her marriage prospects when she was barely out of the nursery. By the time she could write her name without help, ambassadors were already debating which royal cousin would get to claim her hand and her bloodline. When your blood is worth more than your personality, your childhood ends before your teeth come in. And for Maria Antonia of Austria, it already had. If history were a person, this is the moment she'd take a long sigh, put her face in her hands and say, "Oh, not this again." Because yes, they almost married her to her uncle. Not metaphorically, not distantly, her actual biological uncle. The year was 1675. Maria Antonia was 6 years old, small, solemn, already carrying the kind of posture that suggested she'd been practicing for a portrait since birth. Her uncle, King Charles II of Spain, was 13, which under normal circumstances would make him a young boy. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was the Habsburg dynasty, where the laws of genetics, good taste, and basic reason had long been replaced by strategic necessity. You see, Spain was collapsing, not politically, though, yes, also that, but genetically. Charles II was, quite literally, the end of the line, the last full-blooded Habsburg of Spain. And the poor man's body read like a cautionary tale written by a biologist. His jaw was so enlarged, that infamous Habsburg jaw, that he could barely chew his food. His tongue was too large for his mouth. His legs were weak, his spine curved, and his speech slurred. His doctors noted, somewhat unnecessarily, that his head was too large for his body. His mental state wasn't much better, prone to seizures, fits of melancholy, and periods where he was convinced that witches were haunting his bedchamber. At court, they called him El Hechizado, the bewitched king. And honestly, given the state of his DNA, it's hard to blame them for thinking some kind of sorcery was involved. Spain needed an heir. The empire stretched across continents, gold poured in from the Americas, but the throne itself was balanced on the shoulders of a young man who could barely hold his own spoon. The prospect of his death, childless and frail, sent every royal family in Europe into a quiet panic. Who would inherit Spain's glittering empire? The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs had an answer: Maria Antonia. Her father, Emperor Leopold I, was no fool. He knew that the Spanish crown, if it slipped away, would weaken his family's dominance forever. So, in a move that makes modern listeners collectively wince, he decided the solution was to marry his 6-year-old daughter to her 13-year-old uncle. Perfect, right? A political union and, genetically speaking, a dare to evolution itself. It sounds like a dark joke now, but at the time this was considered practical, a way to keep the Spanish and Austrian crowns in the family. After all, why share power with outsiders when you could just recycle it? The engagement was announced. The courtiers bowed. The clerics smiled, and Europe collectively pretended that this wasn't profoundly unsettling. In Vienna, preparations began for a proxy wedding, a ceremony where the groom wouldn't even need to attend in person. One royal representative would stand in for Charles, and the 6-year-old bride would repeat the vows she'd been taught to memorize. You can almost picture it. The child in her miniature gown, standing beneath a golden crucifix, reciting words about obedience and devotion while holding a bouquet heavier than her arm. Somewhere, diplomats were already drafting treaties based on her marriage, maps being redrawn before she'd even learned to read them. And the best part? They didn't even find this unusual. This was Europe's version of business as usual. The royals had been trading children for borders for centuries. Love was something that happened to peasants, not people with titles. But even by 17th century standards, this match raised eyebrows. The Spanish advisors began to panic. They had seen Charles II up close. They knew he wasn't just delicate. He was dying in slow motion. His ability to produce an heir was somewhere between unlikely and biologically impossible. And marrying him to a child, his niece no less, might not strengthen the dynasty. It might just humiliate it. Still, for a brief moment, the empire held its breath. The ambassadors wrote cautious letters. The gossip spread. One nobleman wrote that the emperor means to marry his daughter to Spain's broken king, and thereby join 2 ghosts in one body. Even for the Habsburgs, that was a bit much. And so, after months of arrangements, portrait exchanges, and diplomatic niceties, the Spanish court quietly backed out. They didn't publicly cancel the engagement. That would have been too embarrassing. They simply delayed it until everyone got the message. By the time Maria Antonia turned 7, her wedding dress had been folded away, and Charles II had chosen a different bride, Marie Louise d'Orléans, a French princess sent as part of an alliance with France. She was healthy, elegant, and 15 years old, practically a grandmother compared to Maria. Charles's advisors hoped she might cure him, or at least distract him. She didn't. She died a few years later, childless, exhausted, and, if her letters are any indication, profoundly miserable. And somewhere in Vienna, Maria Antonia continued her lessons, blissfully unaware that she had narrowly escaped becoming the queen of one of the most haunted courts in Europe. If you're wondering what kind of world produces plans like that, it's one where royal blood was treated like treasure and every marriage was a vault. No one cared that Charles II could barely function. They only cared that his blood was pure. That word, pure, carried a kind of religious obsession. It meant legitimacy, divine right, and control. Never mind that the purity was killing them. It's tempting to laugh now, to shake your head and call it absurd. But the truth is, they didn't see it as absurd at all. They saw it as necessary. Every dynasty believed itself chosen by God. And if marrying your niece helped preserve his will, well, who were they to argue with heaven? The irony, of course, is that their devotion to divine will had done what no war could ever do. It had quietly dismantled their bloodline from the inside out. For Maria Antonia, the canceled marriage wasn't the end of her usefulness. It was just a postponement. The moment one match failed, another was discussed. Her name floated between royal courts like a diplomatic parcel, to Savoy, to Bavaria, to anyone with the right titles and the right lineage. Her life was already being negotiated in rooms she'd never enter. You can almost imagine her, still a child, walking through the endless corridors of the Hofburg palace, the sound of her slippers on polished stone echoing through rooms older than memory. Servants bowing, whispers following her like shadows, everyone knowing that her destiny wasn't really hers to hold. And somewhere, far away in Madrid, her uncle, the bewitched king, sat beneath his gilded canopy, drooling over a silver plate, unaware that the little girl meant to save his empire had just been spared from joining him. It's strange to think that one canceled wedding could change so much. But in the story of Maria Antonia, it's one of the few moments where fate almost showed mercy. Almost. Because though she escaped the marriage, she would never escape the curse that made it possible. The same blood that connected her to Charles II, that sacred, poisoned inheritance, still flowed through her veins. And while her uncle's body slowly gave out under the weight of centuries of inbreeding, hers was only just beginning to bear the same burden. Pause. History often talks about the bewitched king, the tragedy of his deformities and his madness. But rarely does it mention the little girl who was almost sacrificed to his throne. The one who, by accident of timing, lived the childhood that Spain's last Habsburg never truly had. You, listening now, already know how this will end. Not with a crown, but with a coffin. But for a moment, in this small reprieve, she was simply a child again. One whose destiny had been delayed by the smallest of miracles. Someone, somewhere, finally said no. She escaped the marriage, but not the curse that came with it. And if you've made it this far, you're clearly braver than half the Habsburgs. So, subscribe, or let this story vanish back into the archives like they did. There's something unnerving about a portrait that's trying too hard to lie. You know the kind. The eyes too soft, the light too kind, the skin too smooth to belong to anyone who's ever stayed up worrying about the future of an empire. That was Maria Antonia's childhood, not written in diaries or stories, but brushed onto canvas. Because long before she spoke in public, long before she was old enough to hold her own opinions, she was already speaking through paint. It began in Vienna, where Emperor Leopold, her father, had a problem to solve. The plan to marry his daughter to the bewitched king of Spain had quietly dissolved, but the political dream hadn't. Spain was still teetering on collapse, and the European vultures were circling. The only thing standing between Austria and losing influence over Spain was the little girl who'd somehow survived her cursed bloodline. So, the emperor decided it was time to reintroduce his daughter to the world, beautifully, strategically, and preferably with less jaw. Enter the painters. Vienna's finest artists were summoned to the palace, their brushes trembling under imperial orders. Their mission? To make a 10-year-old look like salvation. Every detail mattered. The tilt of her head, the softness of her gaze, the way the light fell just so across her hair, catching gold that may or may not have been there in reality. Even her hands were painted with symbolic care. Small, delicate, royal. Not the hands of a child, but of a future queen. They softened her features, rounded the jaw, narrowed the chin, brightened the complexion. The portrait that emerged was lovely, serene, and just the right amount of pure. The artists had performed genetic editing centuries before Photoshop existed. Copies of the painting were sent to every major court in Europe: Madrid, Paris, Florence, Bavaria. And with them went an unspoken message. She's young. She's royal. She's ready. One ambassador described her as a charming princess with the sweetness of youth and the grace of her late mother. That was diplomatic code for the painters did their job. Her image wasn't just decoration. It was propaganda. A political resume in oil and pigment. Every brushstroke said what words could not, that the Habsburg line was still beautiful, still strong, still worth marrying into. Her portrait was her weapon. Though, if we're being honest, it was really just a painting of her father's ambition. You can almost picture the scene in the emperor's private chamber. Him pacing, letters from foreign courts spread across his desk, the candlelight flickering over Maria's newly completed portrait. A painted promise that his dynasty still had something worth offering. Even if, biologically speaking, it was more of a gamble than an investment. But there was another layer to this, something quieter, almost tragic. Maria Antonia's portrait wasn't just about her. It was about her replaceability. For a Habsburg daughter, beauty wasn't vanity, it was currency. And in a world where women ruled only by marriage, being marriageable was a kind of political existence. The irony? Every noble in Europe knew her bloodline was the problem. And yet, that was the very thing that made her valuable. She was both the disease and the cure. Art became the cover-up. When diplomats discussed potential alliances, they'd unfurl her portraits on long tables, lit by candlelight, and lean in like scholars studying relics. They weren't admiring art. They were examining strategy, measuring jawlines against titles, cheekbones against inheritances. One ambassador joked that the emperor's daughter's smile might save Spain. Another replied, or doom it faster. And while all this plotting unfolded, Maria herself was learning how to become the image they were selling. Her tutors taught her how to walk, not like a child, but like a sovereign's daughter. Slow, deliberate, and always aware of who was watching. She learned to curtsy precisely 3 inches lower than her rank required, a trick that conveyed both humility and superiority at once. She learned music, not for pleasure, but for performance, to show refinement at foreign courts. She even practiced fainting gracefully, just in case politics demanded a little delicate femininity. It's strange to think of a 10-year-old rehearsing her personality, but that was her world. Every move was choreography for a life she hadn't chosen. You can almost imagine her sitting in the portrait room, the smell of oil paint thick in the air, her governess straightening her dress for the 5th time. A painter asks her to lift her chin, and she obeys, not because she understands why, but because she's been told obedience looks beautiful. Behind her, the room is cold, sunlight slanting through the tall windows, catching the gilded frames of her ancestors, all of them watching, all of them pale and expressionless, as if passing down the same message. Be perfect, and maybe you'll survive. It wasn't just the painters trying to sculpt her image. The palace gossip machine joined in too. Stories began to circulate that she had inherited her mother's beauty, her father's piety, and none of the Habsburg unfortunate traits. Courtiers repeated it so often it became a kind of spell. The empire needed to believe it. Female succession terrified Europe. A woman with a claim to Spain was both a prize and a provocation. If Maria Antonia married well, she could reunite the empire her ancestors had split apart. If she didn't, she might hand it to someone else entirely. That was the real panic behind the paintings. It wasn't vanity. It was fear. Fear that a girl, a child, might decide the fate of kingdoms. So they painted her to look safe, soft, angelic, a vessel of divine right, not a person with opinions. Because in that world, an obedient woman was far less dangerous than an ambitious one. And somewhere, in all that varnish and politics, Maria Antonia began to understand the lesson every royal daughter eventually learns, that her worth was conditional. Her music was beautiful only if it impressed the right guests. Her smile was valuable only if it pleased the right king. Her very existence was a transaction, a negotiation between nations disguised as a family. The artists captured her likeness, but they missed the loneliness, the waiting, the growing sense that she was being prepared for something she couldn't escape. The portraits remain today, serene, flawless, deceptively peaceful. But if you look closely, her eyes seem tired. Not in the way of someone ill, but in the way of someone who already knows her life isn't hers. One might be tempted to call her lucky, a princess, adored and displayed. But luck in the Habsburg world was always double-edged. The higher you were raised, the harder you fell. And Maria Antonia's next step would be the same as her mother's, her grandmother's, and every royal woman before her. Marriage. Diplomatic proposals started arriving before she was even 12. Spain, still desperate for an heir, considered reopening discussions. France, ever opportunistic, sent feelers through back channels. But the frontrunner was Bavaria, a young prince named Maximilian II Emmanuel, whose lineage was suitably noble and whose ambition matched her father's. Leopold saw an opportunity to strengthen ties with Bavaria, gain political leverage in the Holy Roman Empire, and maybe, just maybe, produce an heir who wouldn't look like a family portrait. And so, Maria Antonia, who had spent her childhood being painted, posed, and prepared, was now to be packaged and sent away once more. You could say she was bred for diplomacy, trained for duty, and varnished for export. You could also say she was a child. But in the gilded language of empire, those two things were the same. And so, as soon as she could walk without a nurse, they sent her to marry someone new. By 16, Maria Antonia of Austria had stopped being a daughter and become a diplomatic solution. The match had been made, the contract signed, the blessings whispered. And the decision, as always, had been made without asking her. Her groom was Maximilian II Emmanuel, the Elector of Bavaria, a man celebrated for his charm, admired for his military record, and politely ignored for his personal behavior. He was, as one court chronicler later wrote, one of the most perverse minds imaginable, which in a century where no one bathed and everyone thought leeches were medicine, is really saying something. The marriage was arranged between two branches of the same extended Habsburg family. Yes, again. They were second cousins, which by this dynasty's standards was practically a refreshing burst of genetic diversity. Vienna celebrated, of course. There were fireworks, banquets, and a week of music echoing through the Hofburg halls. Courtiers smiled, ambassadors congratulated each other, and priests blessed the union as ordained by heaven. Heaven, if it was watching, probably sighed. Because for Maria Antonia, this wedding wasn't about love or even hope. It was about survival. The Spanish question still haunted Europe. Who would inherit the dying empire? Leopold, her father, wanted his line to stay strong. By marrying Maria to the Elector of Bavaria, he could tie his family's fate to another rising power, and perhaps one day, through their children, reclaim Spain without a single drop of blood spilled, except, of course, for hers. The wedding procession in 1685 was as glittering as any Vienna had seen. Maria Antonia wore a gown embroidered with gold thread and tiny pearls, her hair braided with ribbons of crimson and ivory. She looked radiant, composed, impossibly calm. But if you'd looked closely, if you'd seen the stiffness in her smile or the way her hands trembled when the vows began, you might have noticed that she already looked like a statue of herself. The ceremony itself was political theater. Bishops, choirs, endless oaths. Every word spoken was another stitch in the tapestry of alliance. She was no longer her father's daughter, nor her own person. She was now Bavaria's prize. And when the carriages rolled out from Vienna, their wheels crunching through snow and gravel, she didn't look back. Maybe she couldn't. Munich was colder than Vienna, not just in climate, but in temperament. The Bavarian court was strict, militaristic, and bound by protocol that even Maria found suffocating. The courtiers were suspicious of her Austrian roots. To them, she was a political spy wrapped in lace. Her husband, Maximilian, greeted her with courtesy and practiced charm. He was handsome, tall, with a soldier's confidence and a politician's smile. But beneath the charm was calculation. He wanted her title, her connections, her potential claim to Spain, not her company. In public, he was all elegance and chivalry, kissing her hand, calling her mein Engel, my angel. But in private, he was cold, impatient, and easily bored. He surrounded himself with flatterers and mistresses, a rotating cast of women and soldiers who kept his ego as polished as his armor. Maria Antonia was expected to smile through it all, to bear insult as gracefully as she wore her crown. Letters from the Bavarian court speak in careful phrases. Her Highness is delicate. Her Highness prefers solitude. Her Highness prays often. Those are the polite ways of saying she was lonely. Her life became a quiet routine of prayers, music, and waiting. Waiting for her husband to visit her chambers. Waiting for letters from Vienna. Waiting for her health to stop fading. Because it was fading. Slowly, relentlessly. The same Habsburg blood that had cursed her ancestors began to whisper its familiar story. Fatigue, fainting, recurring fevers, endless bouts of pain no physician could quite explain. She wrote to her father that, "The heir of Bavaria does not agree with me," though what she really meant was that nothing there did. And Maximilian, he was too busy to notice. He spent his days hunting, drinking, and campaigning, sometimes literally. Bavaria was embroiled in the endless political chessboard of Europe, and he fancied himself a great general. He had no patience for weakness, least of all from his wife. In public, he paraded her like a trophy. In private, he ignored her. The court gossips adored him. The Blue Elector, they called him, for his bright blue uniforms and his striking presence at festivals. He danced, he joked, he gambled. He was adored. And Maria, quiet, pale, and devout, stood in the background like a ghost wearing jewels. You can almost imagine her in her apartments, sitting by a tall window overlooking Munich's gray rooftops, her breath fogging the glass. Outside, bells ring for mass. Inside, a maid whispers, "Another letter from Vienna, Your Highness." She opens it slowly, her father's handwriting, rigid, distant. He asks about her health, her husband, her duties. She answers politely, never honestly. "All is well," she writes. "I am content." The truth? She was far from it. The Bavarian court, unlike Vienna's, had little warmth for art or music. The long dinners bored her. The gossip drained her. Her closest companions were her ladies-in-waiting, a handful of women who treated her more like a delicate relic than a friend. She began to lose weight. Her letters grew shorter. Physicians were summoned, men with elaborate wigs and little understanding of medicine. They prescribed purges, tonics, and prayer. Through it all, Maximilian remained charming. In public. Behind closed doors, his temper was sharp. When frustrated, he'd snap at her for her quietness, for her frailty, for not being the radiant political partner he'd imagined. He once described her in a private letter as a good soul, but weary, as if born tired. Perhaps she was. One observer wrote, "Her Highness seems to fade daily, as if the sun of Austria has not followed her here." And maybe that was true. Vienna had been her world, its marble corridors, its candle-lit rituals, the faint music of its chapels. Munich, by contrast, felt like exile. The walls were darker, the silences heavier. She wrote often to her half-siblings, letters full of nostalgia for Vienna's gardens, its snow, the sound of her father's musicians playing after dinner. "Here," she wrote once, "there is too much air and too little life." Her husband barely read her letters, even when they were to him. The political alliance was functioning. The appearances were maintained. What more was there to want? But even the most obedient empress can't thrive on appearances alone. By the time she was 18, her health was clearly deteriorating. Chronic fevers returned, and her physicians began to whisper the word melancholia. She couldn't sleep. She fainted during Mass. Her complexion grew pale as marble. In the rare moments when Maximilian noticed, he treated her with polite concern, like one might treat a fragile instrument that had cost a fortune. The courtiers called it devotion. She called it endurance. You can almost see her now, sitting before her mirror, a single candle flickering beside her reflection. The jewels at her neck gleam faintly in the half-light. Somewhere in the palace, music drifts through the walls. Laughter, perhaps a dance. She doesn't rise to join them. She presses a hand to her chest and exhales, slowly, as though even breathing must now be performed. The marriage had done its job. Austria and Bavaria were bound together. The emperor was satisfied. The elector was ambitious. And the bride, the girl who shouldn't have survived infancy, was quietly breaking again, this time not from illness, but from being invisible. She wrote one final letter home that year, simple and weary. "I pray for strength, though I no longer know what to do with it." She signed it, "Your most faithful daughter, Maria Antonia." It reached Vienna long after she'd sealed it, long after her father had stopped expecting news from Bavaria. But for her, the act of writing it mattered. It was a thread stretched back across the Alps, to the city that had once celebrated her as a miracle, and had now traded her for politics. In the quiet of her Bavarian chamber, she folded the letter carefully, pressed her family's seal into the wax, and whispered something almost too soft to catch. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was the last trace of Vienna still alive in her voice. By the time Maria Antonia reached her 20s, her body had become a battlefield between devotion and design. She prayed for strength every morning and her blood quietly ignored her. You see, Maria wasn't just ill, she was engineered to be fragile. Not deliberately, of course. No scientist had planned her into existence, but after 2 centuries of dynastic recycling, the Habsburgs had managed to do what nature itself usually refuses to allow: create a lineage so genetically compact it could barely sustain life. Her bloodline wasn't a river anymore, it was a pond, stagnant, shrinking, and reflecting the same faces over and over again. Historians have a term for it: pedigree collapse, when the same ancestors appear multiple times in your family tree until it starts to look less like a tree and more like a tangle of vines choking themselves. Modern researchers went even further and calculated an inbreeding coefficient, a number that measures how much DNA you share with your ancestors. For Maria Antonia, that number was roughly 0.30. To put that into perspective, that's higher than if your parents had been brother and sister. Her bloodline was an echo chamber, every ancestor whispering the same mutation again and again until the whispers turned into a curse. But no one at court would ever call it that. They still called it purity. The Habsburgs had spent generations defending this so-called divine blood. They believed it made them superior, chosen by God to rule. But what it really did was trap them in a genetic loop of their own making. You can trace the damage like a medical chart written across centuries. Charles II of Spain, Maria's uncle, was born with severe mandibular prognathism, the famous Habsburg jaw, and was so weak he didn't walk until age 8. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his teeth so misaligned he could barely chew, and he suffered seizures, sterility, and chronic infections. His autopsy later revealed a body that was, as one doctor wrote, a miracle it lived at all. And those were the royal symptoms. Across the dynasty, miscarriages were common. Infant mortality soared. Heirs died young, often from fevers or decline, polite euphemisms for a failing immune system. Even their surviving children carried the marks: stunted growth, weak lungs, premature aging. The family portraits, with their pale faces and long chins, became unintentional medical records. Oil-painted evidence of what happens when power refuses to diversify. Maria Antonia inherited the same frail body, the same delicate bones, the same breathless fatigue. But hers came wrapped in silk, perfumed and called divine favor. In Munich, she began suffering from fainting spells and migraines that left her bedridden for days. The physicians called them vapors, as if she were merely overwhelmed by too much luxury. But what she really suffered from was biology, and still, duty demanded she try to produce an heir. Within her first years of marriage, she conceived twice. Both pregnancies ended in grief. The first child, a son, was born early and survived only a few days. The bells that had been prepared to ring in celebration tolled instead for mourning. The second, a daughter, was stillborn. The courtiers offered condolences. Her husband offered silence. For a woman raised to believe that her worth was measured in heirs, this was a quiet devastation. Her letters from that time are few, but one survives, written to her confessor. I pray that my body may yet serve God's purpose. I have given all that I can, yet he finds it unworthy. There's a kind of heartbreak in those words, not the loud, dramatic grief of novels, but the slow, resigned kind that sits quietly in the chest and never leaves. At the Bavarian court, whispers began. The Austrian princess is too sickly, they said. She cannot carry life. Even her husband, Maximilian, lost patience. His attention turned elsewhere, to mistresses, to courtly games, to foreign campaigns. Maria was left behind, drifting between prayer and fever. The palace doctors tried everything. They bled her, of course, because when in doubt, take out more blood from the person who already doesn't have enough. They prescribed powdered gemstones, ground coral, and wine of iron. One even suggested she spend more time outdoors, as if sunlight could fix centuries of genetics. It didn't. Her hair began to thin. Her skin turned nearly translucent. Servants described her as glowing like glass, which sounded poetic, but what they really meant was that she was fading. Even walking across a room exhausted her. She often fainted during Mass and had to be carried away behind closed curtains so the public wouldn't see. There's a strange duality to her life. On paper, she was still a princess, attended by ladies, dressed in silks, her meals served on gold plates. But in reality, she was more a patient than a person. Every room she entered carried the faint smell of medicine and candle wax. Every morning began with whispered prayers for strength, followed by consultations with doctors who disagreed on everything except that she was not improving. Her confessor noted that she accepted her suffering with uncommon grace. But that's the thing about royal grace. It's often just well-rehearsed helplessness. You can imagine her in her private chapel, kneeling on the cold marble floor, her hands trembling as she clutches her rosary. Her lips move through familiar prayers, but her eyes flicker toward the window, where the world carries on without her. She'd been told all her life that her bloodline was holy. But holiness, it seemed, came with symptoms. And yet, even in her weakness, the expectations never stopped. The court still hoped she'd conceive again. She was young after all, 22, 23, and miracles were always expected from the devout. But Maria's body had other plans. Her cycles grew irregular. Her strength waned. She began suffering chest pains and night sweats, likely the signs of tuberculosis or chronic infection, both common in the family. Sometimes, when the pain grew too much, she'd retreat into writing. Her surviving prayer journal is sparse, the handwriting faint. In one entry she wrote, "If my pain is the price of peace, let it be paid." There's something hauntingly calm about that. Not despair, just acceptance. The kind that comes when you realize that your suffering isn't an accident. It's a family tradition. The doctors could not save her, of course, but they were excellent at diagnosing her holiness. Her illness was called a divine trial. Her weakness, a saintly example of patience. Every symptom was transformed into a virtue, every ache into a moral lesson. That's how the court comforted itself, by turning a dying girl into a sermon. Behind the curtain of sanctity, though, the truth was simpler. She was a body bearing the accumulated errors of an empire that had mistaken blood for destiny. Her curse wasn't divine, it was arithmetic. Too many uncles marrying nieces, too many cousins bearing cousins, too many prayers for purity and not enough common sense. Maria Antonia carried all of that in her veins. Every fainting spell, every miscarriage, every breath that rattled too quickly was the sound of her ancestors whispering from the grave, a chorus of ghosts reminding her that the price of power is paid in flesh. And still, she endured it with the quiet dignity of someone who had been taught from birth that endurance itself was a duty. When she appeared at court, she smiled softly, bowed gracefully, and made conversation when required. People whispered that she had the serenity of an angel. But serenity is just another word for surrender when you're out of options. Her father, Emperor Leopold, received reports of her declining health and responded with distant concern. He prayed for her recovery from a distance. He had other children now, healthier ones. Her husband, meanwhile, was already planning his next campaign. Maria had become exactly what her ancestors had designed her to be, a vessel. The only problem was that the vessel was cracked, and no amount of royal blood could fill what was leaking out. If Vienna had been a cradle and Munich a cage, then Brussels was a stage, grand, glittering, and cold to the touch. In 1690, Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria, ever ambitious, ever restless, was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands. It was an enviable title, second only to a crown, and one that came with palaces, parades, and the illusion of real power. For Maria Antonia, it meant another uprooting, another carriage ride away from what little she'd come to know, and another city full of strangers calling her Your Grace, while quietly judging her. The couple arrived to fanfare, trumpets, cannon salutes, confetti of rose petals drifting down from balconies. Brussels welcomed its new rulers as if they were the golden salvation of a weary land. And perhaps they might have been, if they'd actually liked each other. To the people, Maria Antonia was a delicate vision of virtue. Her soft presence meant to balance Maximilian's vanity. Together, they were painted as the perfect pair, the strong governor and his saintly wife. In portraits, they stand side by side, his hand resting on a sword, hers on a prayer book. Two halves of a royal promise. In reality, they were two strangers occupying the same echo. Brussels in winter could chill you from the inside out. The palace, grand and ornate, heavy with mirrors and velvet drapes, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Candlelight flickered against marble walls, reflecting the same image of her again and again, until even she must have wondered which version was real. Her days followed a script: morning mass, audience hours, charity visits, and long, silent dinners beside a man who rarely looked her in the eye. Maximilian was too busy playing statesman. He loved ceremony, loved being adored, loved watching his reflection in the admiration of others. Maria, on the other hand, was fading, slowly, beautifully, and inconveniently. Her health had been fragile before. Now, under the damp chill of Brussels and the weight of her husband's indifference, it began to unravel completely. She coughed often, her appetite vanished, and her letters home grew shorter, weaker, more like sighs on paper than sentences. In one surviving note to a lady-in-waiting in Vienna, she wrote, "The days here are long and heavy. I wake each morning with the same prayer, that God might make the hours shorter." You can almost hear the weariness behind the words, the resignation of someone who had stopped expecting comfort, but still remembered what it felt like. The palace itself mirrored her decline. The servants whispered of drafts that never ended, of rooms that never warmed. The candles smoked faster in her chambers, leaving black trails up the walls. Even the mirrors, some said, seemed to lose their shine. Even the mirrors stopped reflecting her, one attendant wrote years later, as if the palace itself could not bear to look. Meanwhile, Maximilian was thriving. He dazzled at court functions, gave fiery speeches, and flirted shamelessly with nobles and courtiers alike. He was handsome, clever, and fully aware of it. The people adored him, which only made him more intolerable. Rumors of his affairs spread like candlelight catching curtains. There were actresses, widows, and even the wife of a visiting ambassador. None of it was subtle. Court gossip described him as a man to whom every woman was a kingdom, and every conquest a coronation. Maria Antonia, dutiful as ever, pretended not to notice. That was what royal wives were expected to do, pretend. Her role was to stand beside him, smile, and bless the illusion of marital harmony. But silence is not the same as peace. She became a ghost in her own palace, walking the halls like a shadow of the life she might have lived. Servants bowed as she passed, then crossed themselves when she was gone. Her fragility had taken on an almost supernatural quality, as if she were slipping out of the world one breath at a time. At night, she no longer attended balls or dinners. Instead, she sat by her window, overlooking the dim city streets, the faint smell of rain in the air. The candlelight flickered across her face, soft, pale, and growing thinner by the week. Somewhere below, the sound of a carriage would echo, laughter spilling out. Maximilian, no doubt, returning late from another evening of diplomacy. In her solitude, Maria turned inward. Prayer had always been her refuge, quiet, ritualized, unjudging. Now it became her only language. Her private chapel in the Brussels palace was small, a narrow room lined with gold-leaf saints and the faint scent of beeswax. There she'd kneel for hours, her hands clasped, her lips moving in whispers, not asking for miracles anymore, just asking to be seen. One priest later recalled that she spoke of suffering as one speaks of rain, inevitable, cleansing, and beyond control. It wasn't self-pity. It was simply the only truth she had left. The courtiers, of course, adored her piety. They called her the Angel of Brussels. Her fragility made her elegant. Her illness made her saintly. In a world that valued appearances over reality, even dying could be beautiful, as long as you did it gracefully. By early 1691, she was visibly ill. The doctors, those same philosophers in wigs and arrogance, called it dropsy of the chest. In modern terms, it was likely tuberculosis or heart failure. They prescribed wine, fresh air, and optimism, a truly lethal combination. Her husband, meanwhile, had little patience for illness. He found her melancholy embarrassing, her frailty inconvenient. At public appearances, he'd squeeze her hand too tightly, whisper reminders to smile, then drift away to entertain his guests. To be fair, Maximilian didn't hate her. He simply didn't see her. She had become invisible behind the reflection of his own ambition. He once wrote to a friend, "My wife is virtuous and uncomplaining, qualities which in time make conversation impossible." It's hard to compete with a man who finds your silence too loud. Still, there were moments, small, human flashes amid the ceremony. A chambermaid once recorded that, on particularly cold evenings, Maria would ask for her mother's old shawl to be brought from her trunks in Vienna. She'd sit wrapped in it, tracing the embroidery with her fingertips, humming faint Spanish lullabies under her breath. That shawl, a relic of her mother, the Empress Margaret Theresa, was one of the few personal possessions she'd kept through all her relocations. In the end, it was less a comfort and more a tether, something to remind her that she hadn't always been so alone. Her decline was quiet, but unmistakable. The sparkle of court life carried on around her, the balls, the hunts, the endless political dinners, while she withdrew deeper into her rooms, her letters, her prayers. She wrote home one final time that spring, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "Tell my father I am not ungrateful for the path God has given me, though it grows narrow now." Outside, Brussels was blooming, tulips and poplars, laughter in the markets, music spilling from taverns. But inside the palace, the air felt still, heavy, expectant. The courtiers lowered their voices when passing her door. They could hear her coughing through the walls at night. Yet still, she attended Sunday Mass. Still, she smiled when addressed. Still, she carried herself with the same poise that had once been painted onto her, though now the color was fading. It's a strange thing about royal tragedy. It doesn't announce itself. It just lingers, quietly, until one day everyone realizes the person they've been bowing to is already halfway gone. Even the mirrors seem to know it. Once polished daily, they began to cloud at the edges, as though the silver beneath them couldn't bear to keep her reflection anymore. Even the mirrors stopped reflecting her, one servant whispered, as if the palace itself couldn't bear to look. But for all her fragility, Maria Antonia's story wasn't finished yet. Fate, it seemed, had one last cruel kindness left to offer, the chance to go home. Her doctors urged it. Her father allowed it. Vienna, they said, might restore her, or at least let her die surrounded by family instead of marble. And so, after months of illness, she packed her few belongings, letters, rosaries, her mother's shawl, and prepared for another journey. The carriages stood waiting at dawn, their wheels glinting faintly in the mist. She was too weak to walk without help, yet insisted on descending the stairs, unaided. Her ladies held their breath as she stepped into the pale Brussels morning, thin, trembling, and stubbornly alive. The streets were quiet as she left, the city unaware that its angel was vanishing. But she would not die there. Not yet. And if you're still here with her, you're officially in too deep to leave now. So subscribe, or this story will vanish before you ever find it again. In the winter of 1691, the carriages creaked through the misted roads out of Brussels, iron wheels biting into frozen mud. Inside one of them sat a woman wrapped in furs, pale and exhausted, her breath fogging the window as the city faded behind her. Maria Antonia of Austria was leaving, and not politely. The official reports would call it a journey for her health, a temporary retreat to her father's court. But everyone in Europe knew the truth. The Electress of Bavaria was fleeing her husband, and she was doing it while pregnant. It was, to put it mildly, a scandal. Royal women didn't run away. They wilted gracefully, they prayed obediently, they waited for fate to decide their misery. But Maria Antonia, the quiet, sickly daughter of the emperor, had decided to do something far more shocking. She decided she'd had enough. The reason was simple, if not entirely respectable. She was dying in Brussels, literally. Her health had collapsed completely. The endless damp, the exhaustion, the emotional strain, it had all caught up to her. She could barely stand. Her cough had turned to blood, and while her husband Maximilian continued hosting banquets and chasing women, Maria lay in her rooms counting her pulse and wondering which beat would be her last. So, when her doctors suggested that returning to Vienna might help her recover, she didn't hesitate. Vienna wasn't home anymore, but it was hers, the only place where she wasn't a stranger in silk. The problem, of course, was Maximilian. The Elector of Bavaria did not appreciate being abandoned mid-governorship, especially not by a wife who was supposed to represent his dignity in public. He tried to forbid it. Then, when she persisted, he tried to delay it. And finally, when none of that worked, he tried pretending it was his idea. He announced, with great solemnity, that his beloved consort was being sent to Vienna for the preservation of her health and the joy of her father. He conveniently left out the part where she refused to let him accompany her. It was, politically speaking, a mess. A royal wife defying her husband was unthinkable, but a royal wife defying him and taking an unborn heir with her? That was nearly treasonous. Envoys gossiped, ministers panicked, and pamphlets spread across Europe debating who was to blame. Some said it was Maximilian's temper. Others whispered that Vienna had manipulated her return. One commentator wrote, "The princess escapes Bavaria as though fleeing a tomb," which in fairness was more accurate than he knew, because by then Munich and Brussels had both become tombs to her, beautiful, gilded, and suffocating. And so, with doctors and attendants in tow, she made the long journey east, the same route she'd once taken as a blushing bride, now retraced as a ghost of herself. Imagine being so miserable you'd rather return to your father, the same man who once tried to marry you to your uncle. That's how bad it was. The journey was grueling. The winter roads were half frozen, the air sharp as glass. They traveled slowly, stopping often so she could rest. Her attendants described her sitting silently for hours, one hand resting over her stomach, the other clutching her mother's old shawl. She hardly spoke, but when she did, she asked simple questions. How far to Vienna? Were the bells still ringing there in the mornings? Did the emperor still keep musicians playing after supper? It wasn't nostalgia, so much as survival. The way a drowning person thinks of land. Some nights she'd wake coughing, blood staining her handkerchief. The physicians murmured reassurances she no longer believed. In her weaker moments, she must have wondered whether she'd even live to see the city again. But she did. When her carriage finally crossed the Austrian border, the bells of a small town rang to welcome her, a gesture arranged by her father's officials. She wept quietly when she heard them. It was the first sound of home she'd heard in years. Vienna, when it appeared on the horizon, looked just as she'd remembered, proud, cold, and impossibly still. Snow drifted down over the spires, softening the edges of the city. The Hofburg palace glowed faintly through the haze, that same labyrinth of marble corridors and candlelight she had once wandered as a child. And somewhere deep inside, waiting behind layers of ceremony, was her father. Emperor Leopold I greeted her formally, as emperors do. But there was a flicker, just a moment, of something resembling affection. He kissed her forehead, blessed her, and told her she would be safe now. Safe was a relative term, of course. Vienna was safer than Brussels only in the way a slower death is safer than a quick one. But for Maria Antonia, it was enough. The court watched the reunion carefully. They whispered that the prodigal daughter had returned, that the emperor's little girl had fled from her husband's cruelty, that perhaps, just perhaps, God had given her one last chance to find peace before taking her. The scandal, however, didn't fade so easily. Letters flew between Vienna and Munich. Maximilian was livid. He accused Vienna of stealing his wife and demanded her return. The emperor ignored him. And for the first time in her life, Maria Antonia found herself under her father's protection, not as a pawn, but as a person. Well, almost. The imperial court was polite but tense. Everyone was careful around her, deferential, cautious, as if afraid she might break mid-conversation. Visitors were instructed to speak softly, avoid upsetting topics, and never mention Bavaria unless she brought it up herself. She rarely did. Instead, she spent her days quietly, often seated by the window of her old apartments overlooking the snow-covered courtyard. She liked the way the snow fell, slow and steady, indifferent to politics, indifferent to pain. It was the only thing in her world that didn't demand anything from her. The city outside carried on as usual, the chatter of markets, the tolling of bells, the rhythm of Vienna's ordinary life. Inside the palace, the air was gentle, almost sacred. Servants described her as calm, fragile, and faintly luminous. As if her body were already half light, one wrote. Her father arranged for her to have constant care, doctors, attendants, a confessor. But even with the finest medicine and comfort that empire could provide, it was clear she was fading. Her pregnancies had drained her illnesses hollowed her, and her spirit, that quiet endurance that had kept her alive for so long, was nearly spent. Still, for the first time in years, she was content. She wrote to a friend in secret saying, "The cold here is kind. It feels like forgiveness." In Vienna, she could finally breathe without pretending. No banquets, no politics, no husband's shadow looming behind her. Just stillness, the one luxury she'd never been allowed. At night, the palace grew silent, the corridors empty except for the faint echo of guards' boots and the low hum of wind through the stone. Sometimes she'd walk them alone, trailing her fingers along the walls, like she was retracing her own past. Every corner was familiar, every doorway a memory. The chapel where she'd once prayed as a child still stood, candles flickering before the same worn icons. She would kneel there, whispering prayers not for healing anymore, but for understanding. And if anyone had stood close enough, they might have heard her murmur, "I am home now. Let that be enough." In the months that followed, her condition worsened, but so did her serenity. Visitors often remarked that she seemed unafraid. "There is peace in her face," one said, though I do not know if it is peace or surrender. Maybe it was both. After all, Maria Antonia had lived her entire life in the service of other people's ambitions, born for politics, raised for marriage, traded for treaties. But here, in the city where it all began, she finally belonged to no one but herself. For the first time, her reflection was her own. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, as though the heavens themselves were trying to erase the noise of history. But peace never lasted long for the Habsburgs. It was winter again in Vienna, the kind that muffles the city into silence. Snow blanketed the palace roofs, icicles hung from the eaves, and every sound outside the Hofburg seemed distant, softened by the cold. Inside, however, the air was thick with anticipation. Candles burned day and night, midwives scurried through corridors, the emperor himself paced in the next room, clutching his rosary, because after years of illness, exile, and despair, Maria Antonia of Austria, frail, pale, and miraculously pregnant, was about to give birth. The date was October 28, 1692, and all of Vienna seemed to be holding its breath. This was no ordinary birth. This was politics swaddled in linen. If the child lived, he could one day unite two empires, Austria and Spain, under one crown. The Habsburg dream, cracked and bleeding for generations, might finally be mended by the smallest of hands. Maria knew it. Everyone did. And yet for her, this wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion. She had spent months confined to her rooms, too weak to walk, surviving on broth and prayer. Every movement hurt. Every breath came with effort. The doctors warned that her body might not survive another childbirth. But in that world, her body wasn't hers to protect. It was Europe's to gamble with. The labor lasted through the night. The wind howled against the palace windows as if mimicking her cries. Hours passed. Candles burned down to stubs. The court physicians murmured Latin prayers between commands. And then, finally, a cry. A baby's. The court erupted. Bells rang across the city, echoing off snow-dusted rooftops. The priests declared it a miracle. A boy. He was christened Joseph Ferdinand Leopold of Bavaria, a name chosen to honor both his father's line and his mother's. In that moment, it seemed as though all of Europe leaned closer to listen. An heir, healthy, breathing, wailing, born of the two most powerful dynasties on the continent. The baby's arrival sent a ripple through every royal court. Letters flew out of Vienna within hours. The Archduchess has delivered a son. Spain rejoiced. Bavaria rejoiced. Vienna nearly collapsed from relief. Even Maximilian, the husband she had fled from, declared the event a divine blessing. Maria, lying pale and trembling in her bed, could barely lift her head. She asked only one question. "Is he strong?" When they told her yes, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Then it was worth it." But her smile didn't last. Within days, the fevers returned. The doctors called it childbed fever, what we now know as a postpartum infection. In the 17th century, it was as common as it was deadly. The same doctors who delivered the child would go from autopsies to childbirth without washing their hands. The same tools were used, unclean, from one mother to the next. And so, while Vienna celebrated, infection crept through her veins. At first, it seemed like fatigue. Then the chills began. Then the pain. Soon her fever burned so high that attendants had to open the windows in the middle of winter to cool her. She asked to see her son again. The nurses brought him, swaddled tightly, his tiny face rosy against the white of the blankets. She looked at him for a long time, memorizing every detail, the curve of his nose, the softness of his skin. No one said it aloud, but everyone in the room knew she wouldn't see him again. "She gave Europe an heir," one attendant whispered later, "and Europe took her life in return." It sounds poetic now, but at the time it was simply cruel. Her greatest success was also her undoing. Even her father, so formal, so restrained, couldn't hide his grief. The emperor who had spent his life calculating alliances now found himself helpless before a dying daughter. He visited her chamber only once, standing silently at her bedside, his lips moving in prayer. When she tried to speak, he hushed her gently and said, "Rest now. You have done your duty." Duty. That word had followed her since birth, a blessing and a curse sealed into her blood. By the third day, the fever had taken her voice. By the fourth, her consciousness. She drifted in and out of delirium, whispering prayers, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes murmuring her son's name. One of her ladies-in-waiting recorded that, in her final hours, she seemed calm, like one who has grown tired of pain and simply lets go. On December 24th, 1692, as the bells of Christmas Eve tolled across Vienna, Maria Antonia of Austria, daughter of an emperor, wife of an elector, and mother of Europe's most fragile hope, died at the age of 23. The court was stunned. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. The newborn Joseph Ferdinand now stood as the heir to both Austria and Spain. Every nation that had once schemed for control of those crowns began plotting anew. Letters that should have been condolences were really calculations. France, England, and the Dutch Republic all began drafting strategies for what would come next. But for Vienna, that could wait. For now, there was mourning. Her funeral was solemn, the great chapel filled with black-veiled courtiers and the heavy scent of incense. A choir sang softly as her coffin, white, lined with gold, was carried through the palace courtyard, dusted with snow. She had always been a quiet presence in life. In death, she was quieter still. The irony was almost unbearable. She had finally done everything expected of her, married strategically, conceived an heir, ensured dynastic survival, and the reward was oblivion. Her body was laid to rest in the imperial crypt beside her mother, Margaret Theresa, another royal woman broken by childbirth. Generations of Habsburg women lay around her, their names etched in marble, queens, archduchesses, empresses, all sacrificed to the same idea, that blood was more sacred than breath. As the coffin was lowered, a faint draft of air passed through the chapel, enough to flicker the candles. The priest paused, perhaps out of reverence, perhaps out of superstition. Someone whispered, "She's gone to join her mother." But if there was peace for her, it was a quiet one. Back in her chambers, the child slept under heavy blankets, attended by nurses and watched by guards. The same nobles who had ignored Maria in life now bowed before his cradle. He was, after all, the future of Europe. And so, the bells that had tolled for her funeral would soon ring again, this time for the infant who had outlived her. But not for long, because while Europe saw in him a symbol of hope, fate saw him as just another heir born into a curse that refused to die. The child would outlive her, but not by much. Vienna slept beneath a blanket of snow that Christmas Eve in 1692, but inside the Hofburg palace, the air was heavy with wax and sorrow. The bells that had rung to celebrate a royal birth just weeks before now tolled for a death. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the frozen streets, one for each year of her life. 23. Maria Antonia of Austria had taken her last breath before dawn. The servants said it was quiet, almost graceful. She simply exhaled and never drew another breath. No struggle, no spectacle, just stillness. The kind of death that looks like sleep, except that the room never warms again. The candles burned low beside her bed. Her rosary, still wrapped around her hand, glinted in the soft light. A nurse crossed herself and whispered, "She looks relieved." And maybe she was. For 23 years she had carried the weight of dynasties in her veins. Now, for the first time, it wasn't her burden anymore. Even her coffin, when it was built, seemed lighter than it should have been. Her bones thinned by generations of royal inbreeding. Her body so slight that one attendant remarked, "She seemed made of glass." The news spread quickly. Messengers galloped through the snow to deliver the announcement to Munich, Madrid, Paris, and London. By the time her body was laid out for mourning, half of Europe was already debating what her death meant for the map. Because the truth was this: she had been more than a woman. She was a bridge between Austria and Spain, between the old Habsburg line and whatever would come next. And now that bridge had collapsed. In Vienna, the courtiers wept politely. The emperor wept privately. The diplomats, however, barely waited for the tears to dry. Letters flew across Europe that very night. Plans were redrawn, treaties reconsidered, and the word succession whispered in every palace hall. Her husband, Maximilian, sent a letter of condolences so coldly formal it might as well have been dictated by a secretary. He called her an exemplary wife and Christian soul, then immediately requested that their son remain in Bavaria for the continuity of his rightful inheritance. Her father refused, and so, even before her body had cooled, two empires were already fighting over her child. Nothing says Christmas spirit like a succession crisis. The funeral took place on a bitterly cold morning. Snow fell in soft, perfect silence, blanketing the palace courtyard in white. The bells rang again, slower now, their echoes fading into the mist. Inside the chapel, candlelight flickered against black velvet drapes. The air smelled of incense, beeswax, and wilted lilies. The choir sang softly, not triumphant hymns, but quiet requiems that seemed to hover between grief and sleep. Her coffin rested at the center of the aisle, white, lined with gold trim, crowned with her emblem. Around it stood the emperor, his court, and a handful of those who had known her closely, though few could say they had ever really known her. She had been too gentle for politics, too fragile for the throne, too obedient for her own survival. And now, even in death, she was perfect, serene, composed, and politically convenient. The priest spoke of divine will, of the flower plucked too soon by God's wisdom. But the faces in the pews told a different story, one of exhaustion. The empire had been losing its heirs faster than it could name them. As the prayers droned on, the courtiers fanned themselves discreetly, trying not to yawn. A few whispered about who might inherit Spain now that Maria's claim and her body were gone. One minister was heard muttering, "The Lord gives, and diplomacy takes away." The emperor, however, said nothing. He sat rigid through the entire service, hands clasped, his face unreadable. When the final benediction ended, he rose, approached the coffin, and placed a single white rose upon it. Then he turned and walked out without a word. The courtiers followed. One by one, the candles around the coffin were extinguished until only a single flame remained, trembling in the draught. The choir stopped singing. The silence that followed was almost reverent, as if the entire palace had exhaled at once. Later that night, her body was carried to the imperial crypt, the same burial vault that had received generations of Habsburgs before her. The monks led the procession, chanting softly as they descended the stone steps beneath the Augustinian church. The flicker of their lanterns cast shadows on the carved walls where hundreds of her ancestors already slept. Her coffin was placed beside her mother's, Margaret Teresa, another young woman consumed by duty and childbirth. 2 generations, 2 lives, the same quiet end. There's a cruel symmetry in that. When the final prayer was spoken, the tomb was sealed. A slab of marble pressed into place, her name etched beside those of emperors and queens. Maria Antonia of Austria, 1669-1692. That was all the world would see. 2 dates, 1 dash, and nothing of the suffering in between. Outside, the snow kept falling. The city glowed faintly in the distance, unaware that its history had just shifted. In the days that followed, the mourning period was brief. The emperor ordered black drapes hung in the palace, but by the new year, the music returned. Life in court moved on, as it always did. The diplomats, meanwhile, were already sharpening their quills. The great question now was Spain. Who would inherit? Maria's son, Joseph Ferdinand, was the obvious choice. A child who, by blood, united the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs with the Bavarian line. For a brief moment, it seemed as though her death might finally fulfill what her life never could: the unification of Europe's greatest houses. The irony would have amused her, if amusement had been possible anymore. Because as the politicians celebrated the newborn heir, no one noticed the bitter echo left behind. Maria Antonia had been the last direct descendant of the old Spanish Habsburgs, the final drop of what they called pure blood. And that purity, so long worshipped, had come at a price too steep to survive. When she died, The line effectively died with her. Her son carried her legacy, yes, but diluted, uncertain, fragile. The royal blood that had once been guarded like treasure was finally too thin to sustain the weight of an empire. And somewhere, deep beneath the church where her body rested, that cursed bloodline finally went still. The marble above her tomb was cold to the touch, but in the candlelight, it shimmered faintly, as though her story hadn't quite decided whether to fade or to linger. Europe, of course, didn't linger. It never does. By the time the first snow melted, new treaties were being drawn, new marriages arranged, new alliances born out of her ashes, the same cycle turning again. She had given everything, her youth, her health, her peace, to keep that system alive. And in return, history gave her what it gives most women of power, a footnote. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of candlelight, the whisper of a prayer in the cold crypt air, the echo of a lineage finally going quiet. That was the last breath of the pure blood. And that's exactly what followed. And if you're still awake, you clearly belong here. So subscribe before you vanish like the Habsburgs did. When Maria Antonia died, the palace fell quiet. But history, unfortunately, never does. For a brief, trembling moment, her infant son, Joseph Ferdinand, became the living symbol of peace in Europe. He was the heir everyone could agree on, a Bavarian prince with Austrian and Spanish blood. His birth was supposed to end centuries of dynastic squabbling. The Habsburgs would get their legacy. The Bourbons would stay in France. The map, finally, would stop bleeding. But history loves irony almost as much as it loves repetition. Because while Europe saw in Joseph Ferdinand a bridge between empires, fate saw him as another Habsburg child with a ticking clock in his blood. He grew up healthy, cheerful, and clever, which was already a rarity in his family. His tutors adored him. His father paraded him like a miracle. And Vienna, still haunted by his mother's death, watched him as if watching her ghost in miniature. For 6 short years, he was the promise of everything she died for. And then, one winter morning in 1699, the coughing began. At first, it was dismissed as a chill. Then came the fever, the rash, the spots, smallpox. Within days, the future of Europe was gone. Another small coffin added to a dynasty that had spent centuries building its own graveyard. He was 6 years old. One diplomat wrote dryly, "The prince has followed his mother into peace and left us all to war." And that's exactly what happened. The balance of power that Maria's life had held together by sheer biological endurance snapped the moment her son died. Suddenly, Spain, the great crumbling empire of the Habsburgs, had no heir. The last of the Spanish line, King Charles II, was still alive, but barely. The man was a walking genealogy experiment, his inbreeding coefficient even higher than Maria's. His body was a collection of medical footnotes, sterile, epileptic, half-blind, and reportedly unable to chew properly. The Spanish court called him the Bewitched. The French court called him the miracle that still breathes. When he died childless in 1700, Europe lost its mind. Centuries of breeding for stability had finally created the biggest instability in European history. 2 sides emerged, each claiming the Spanish crown. On one, the Austrian Habsburgs, desperate to keep the empire under their name. On the other, France, whose king, Louis XIV, declared that his grandson, Philip of Anjou, would inherit Spain. And just like that, the ghosts of Maria's bloodline pulled Europe back into chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession began, a war that stretched from 1701 to 1714, involving every major power on the continent: Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and much of the Holy Roman Empire on one side, France, Spain, and their allies on the other. For 13 years, Europe tore itself apart over who got to wear the crown of a dynasty that was already dead. The irony, of course, was exquisite. The Habsburgs had spent centuries marrying their cousins to prevent foreign interference. The result? A war so wide and bloody that it made foreign interference the new normal. The war wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was fought in ballrooms, at negotiation tables, in the pages of newspapers. It was about pride, politics, and the ghost of a woman whose bloodline could no longer answer back. Some of the battles were catastrophic: Blenheim, Ramillies, Malplaquet, names that became shorthand for the stupidity of men in wigs who thought they could solve genetics with gunpowder. Tens of thousands died. Nations bankrupted themselves, and all of it in the name of dynastic inheritance, the same inheritance that had killed Maria Antonia, her son, and the very idea of pure royal blood. The great European project of keeping power in the family had finally succeeded in collapsing the family itself. The Habsburgs, once the most powerful dynasty in Europe, limped out of the war with pride intact, but territory in tatters. Austria got some land. England got trade routes. France got the satisfaction of keeping the Spanish throne, now ruled by a Bourbon, Philip V, who was both grandson and political revenge to Louis XIV. The Habsburg name would linger in history, but the age of their monopoly was over. Spain was no longer Habsburg Spain. It was Bourbon Spain, a new dynasty, fresher blood, different mistakes waiting to happen. The cursed blood had finally run out, replaced not by purity, but by pragmatism. And that, in the end, was Europe's lesson, though it took millions of lives to learn it. The obsession with pure blood, with sacred lineages, with divine marriages and perfect pedigrees, had led to nothing but stillbirths, fevers, and endless funerals. Maria Antonia's silence, her suffering, her death, all of it was absorbed by history and then recycled into the next war, the next alliance, the next tragedy. Because that's what Europe does best. It turns bloodlines into borders and bodies into bargaining chips. Somewhere in the imperial crypt, her marble coffin still rests beside her mother's. No crown, no grandeur. Just a name, 2 dates, and the faint echo of a world that believed it could cheat biology with ceremony. If she could see what followed, perhaps she would have smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition. Because in the end, the Habsburgs' greatest victory wasn't their empire. It was their extinction. The line that had ruled half the known world had finally bred itself out of existence. And when the war finally ended in 1714, with treaties signed and thrones reassigned, Europe exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion. New kings rose, new alliances formed, and the memory of Maria Antonia faded into the background hum of history. But for those who look closely, her story is still there, hidden in the footnotes of treaties and the portraits of kings. The girl who was born more inbred than a child of siblings. The woman whose blood carried the ghosts of an empire. The princess who gave Europe its heir and paid for it with her life. And when the last musket fell silent, when the diplomats finally put down their quills, the lesson of her dynasty was carved quietly into history. Purity is a myth, power is temporary, and blood, no matter how royal, always runs out. The cursed blood finally ran out, replaced not by purity, but by pragmatism. And with that, the great Habsburg experiment ended, not in triumph, but in the whisper of a war born from her silence. If you ever wander through the galleries of Vienna or Madrid, you might pass her without noticing. A young woman in lace, her gaze soft, her posture perfect, her hands resting delicately on a bouquet of flowers or a gilded chair. No name leaps out from the frame. Just another Habsburg princess, painted to look serene. But look closely, and you'll find her. Maria Antonia of Austria. Her portrait survived her, even when her body and her name faded from memory. They hang quietly on the walls of history, glowing faintly under museum lights, her face unchanged, her story unspoken. She was painted dozens of times, each canvas more careful than the last. The artists were under strict instructions. No signs of weakness, no fatigue, nothing unbecoming of a princess. So they painted her the way Europe preferred to remember its doomed women, beautiful, obedient, and vaguely glowing. Her eyes, in nearly every painting, have the same look, calm, glassy, too composed to be human. They don't follow you like other portraits do. They stare through you, like someone who's already accepted how little choice she has. Her skin is impossibly pale, almost translucent, but the painters called it radiant. The faint shadows under her eyes became graceful melancholy. The thinness of her frame, ethereal delicacy. Every symptom of her collapsing health was transformed into a mark of divine virtue. Because in the 17th century, fragility wasn't a flaw, it was a brand. When a man looked ill, it was a tragedy. When a woman did, it was poetry. Painters like Benjamin Bloch and Jan Thomas van Yperen captured her not as she was, but as the court wanted her to be, the perfect symbol of royal endurance. They painted her body into a sermon, a warning and a wish. The lace, the pearls, the faint smile, all of it was camouflage. Behind that calm porcelain surface was a body that could barely stand upright for more than an hour, a heart that beat too fast, lungs that struggled for air. But you'd never know that from the art. The portraits never show the fevers, the coughing, the endless miscarriages. They don't show the blood-stained sheets, the shaking hands, the pain she called God's arithmetic. They show perfection, a porcelain doll holding the weight of the world's expectations, and never allowed to crack. It's strange, isn't it? The very thing that destroyed her, her fragility, became the reason she was immortalized. History likes its martyrs polished. The painters did their job well. They erased the woman and left behind the emblem. They took the living Maria Antonia, anxious, devout, exhausted, and turned her into a ghost that never aged, never ached, never asked for more than she was given. Even the posture says it all. Shoulders drawn back, head tilted, hands clasped, or gently gesturing toward heaven, as though she's in on the secret that her life was never really hers. You can almost hear the court whispering behind the frame. Look at her, so graceful, so pure, so obedient. No one painted her laughing. No one painted her walking outdoors, or reading, or breathing freely. Only waiting, always waiting. There's one portrait, a smaller one, often overlooked, that tells the truth more honestly than the rest. It's unfinished. Her eyes are half shaded, her mouth faintly downturned, as if the artist ran out of time. Or she did. The colors are muted, the hands ghostly pale. You can almost sense the tremor that must have passed through the painter's hand as he realized the subject wouldn't live to see it completed. In that unpolished version, the art finally stumbles into honesty. It doesn't show royalty. It shows exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that sits not in the body, but in the soul. The fatigue of being born to serve history instead of living inside it. Today, her portraits hang between queens and cousins, surrounded by walls thick with genealogy, each face resembling the next. The same jawline, the same eyes, the same faint trace of sadness. A gallery of repetition, proof of how little change the Habsburgs allowed, even in their portraits. And somewhere, amid that symmetry, Maria Antonia's face disappears into the pattern. Visitors pass by, reading the placard. Archduchess of Austria, Electress of Bavaria, born 1669, died 1692. Then they move on. No mention of the infections. No mention of the flight from Brussels. No mention of the son who would die at 6 years old, ending the line she died to preserve. History prefers tidy endings. But if you listen in those quiet galleries, when the tourists have gone and the lights dim for the night, there's something haunting in those paintings. The silence thickens. Her eyes, those calm, glassy eyes, seem to sigh. It's the sigh of someone who's been misunderstood for 300 years. Her tomb in Vienna tells a similar story. You'd expect marble angels, golden inscriptions, something befitting a woman born to 2 empires. Instead, you find simplicity, a small stone slab among dozens, marked only by her name, Maria Antonia of Austria. No title, no praise, just a name. It's tucked away in the Capuchin crypt, beneath the city's streets, the same crypt that holds emperors and empresses, lined in neat rows like chess pieces put back in their box. Hers is easy to miss. You'd walk right past it unless you knew to look down. There are no flowers, no grand epitaphs, just the faint scent of dust and candle wax. And perhaps that's fitting. Because for all the pomp in the portraits, Maria Antonia's real legacy isn't in grandeur. It's in the quiet way she slipped through history, gentle, dutiful, half forgotten. The world remembered her face, but not her suffering. It remembered her beauty, but not her bravery. Even her ghost must be tired of being symbolic, tired of being reduced to a single expression, tired of being the lesson instead of the life. And maybe, in a way, that's what immortality feels like when you never asked for it. So if you ever find yourself in one of those galleries, standing before her portrait, beneath the glare of glass and history, take a moment. Don't look at the lace or the pearls. Look at her eyes. Imagine what it must have felt like to carry a dynasty in your bloodstream and know it was slowly killing you. Imagine being remembered only for your composure. And imagine, just for a second, that she could step out of that frame, shake the dust of centuries from her dress, and whisper, "Enough." Because that's what the portraits never show. The moment the story should have ended differently. But art, like royalty, has no patience for rebellion. So she remains there, frozen, flawless, and silent. A ghost painted into eternity. And history, in its strange and sleepless way, keeps gazing back. If you walk through the Capuchin crypt in Vienna today, you can hear your footsteps echo. The air is cool, dry, and still, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. Beneath the stone arches lie centuries of Habsburgs, emperors, queens, archduchesses, children, all the crowns, all the power, all the divine right, now reduced to the same quiet dust. And somewhere among them, almost hidden, lies Maria Antonia of Austria, her name carved modestly, her coffin smaller than most, her story nearly forgotten. No golden effigy, no grand epitaph, just a name. You could walk past it and never know that this was once one of the most genetically royal women in Europe. The culmination of centuries of ambition and bloodlines, a dynasty that had spent generations marrying itself toward perfection, only to discover perfection was just another word for extinction. Because that was the irony of it all. The more the Habsburgs chased purity, the more fragile they became. Every crown she might have worn was built from the same rusted blood. It's easy now to laugh at their obsession. The endless charts and pedigrees, the uncles marrying nieces, the cousins producing cousins until the family tree started to look less like a tree and more like a tightly knotted rope. But to them it wasn't madness, it was strategy. They believed blood was the only thing they could truly trust. Armies failed, alliances shifted, treaties dissolved, but family they thought was forever. So they bound themselves tighter and tighter until the whole thing collapsed inward. By the time Maria Antonia was born, that blood was already whispering warnings. The faces might have looked serene in their portraits, but behind those long Habsburg chins and drooping eyes was a lineage slowly strangling itself. In the end, the curse wasn't in her blood. It was in their belief that blood was everything. That belief turned children into currency, love into treaties, and generations into genetic experiments. They traded health for heritage, flesh for fame, and called it destiny. And Maria Antonia, gentle, pious, fragile Maria, became the last echo of that dream. The final note in a song that had gone on too long. She didn't live to see what her death would cause. Her son, Joseph Ferdinand, the precious child Europe pinned its hopes on, would die just 6 years later, at the age of 7, from a fever. With him went the last unbroken thread connecting the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg lines. The carefully woven web of power and pedigree unraveled in one generation. Within a decade, Europe was at war again, the War of the Spanish Succession, as kings and cousins fought over what was left of her blood. It was chaos disguised as politics. Armies marched, empires burned, and millions suffered over a lineage that had already self-destructed. Somewhere in the crypt, she slept through all of it. The marble above her didn't move, the candles flickered, the bells tolled, and the world she died to preserve went on destroying itself without her. If there's any comfort in her story, it's that she never had to see how pointless it all was. Imagine it. The grand palaces she once inhabited, the Hofburg, the Munich residence, the Brussels court, still stand. Their walls lined with portraits of the people who slowly destroyed themselves. Chandeliers still glitter. Tourists still gasp at the gold. And yet, none of it hides the truth. The empire that married itself to death didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper that sounded suspiciously like a cough, or a prayer, or a plea to stop. It's almost poetic, the way history turns grandeur into irony. The Habsburgs built cathedrals to celebrate their divine lineage, and now those same cathedrals are museums. Their portraits, once propaganda, now serve as cautionary tales. Their genealogies, those endless tangled charts, now appear in textbooks under the heading Pedigree Collapse. And Maria Antonia? She's the footnote at the end of that paragraph, the quiet proof of how devotion to bloodline can bleed a dynasty dry. If you close your eyes and picture her, not the painted version, but the real one, you might see a young woman standing by a frosted window, the snow of Vienna drifting outside, her face pale, her hands trembling, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, the sound of distant bells. Ahead of her, the weight of a history she never chose. She probably thought she was just playing her part. The obedient daughter, the dutiful wife, the mother who tried to give the world its next emperor. She couldn't have known that she would instead give it its quietest ending. Because that's what she did. She ended it. Not with rebellion or scandal, but with silence. The silence of one body too weak to continue carrying centuries of mistakes. The silence that falls after the last candle burns out. The silence that doesn't need to be remembered to matter. Centuries later, scientists would study her family tree and turn her tragedy into data. They'd calculate inbreeding coefficients, trace genetic disorders, map how a single dynasty could collapse from its own arrogance. They'd give names to the symptoms: mandibular prognathism, infertility, immune deficiency. They'd reduce entire generations of pain into neat percentages and tidy Latin words. And yet none of that explains what it felt like to be Maria Antonia, to live in a world where your worth was measured by how little new blood you introduced, to love people who saw you as a vessel, not a person, to pray for strength, knowing that even God seemed to have lost interest by the 5th generation. That kind of quiet horror doesn't make it into the textbooks. It lingers in the spaces between words, in the sigh of an old portrait, in the cool silence of a crypt, in the faint echo of a dynasty that finally ran out of breath. If there's a lesson in her story, it's not about genetics. It's about belief. Belief so powerful it can build empires and blind people to the fact that those empires are rotting from the inside. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen. They believed their blood carried divine right, that mixing with lesser lineages would dilute their greatness. They believed purity was strength, not realizing that strength only exists in diversity, in change, in adaptation, in imperfection. They believed in eternity, and in doing so, they forgot how to survive the present. Maria Antonia inherited all of that: the devotion, the duty, the doomed certainty that her suffering was sacred. And maybe in her last breath, she understood what her ancestors never did, that nothing holy should hurt this much. If you stand before her tomb today, there's no sound except the soft hum of the air and the faint clicking of distant footsteps. The world above her has moved on. Cars pass over the cobblestones. Vienna glows with cafe lights and music. But down there, beneath the city, time has stopped. She lies among the same people who gave her their curse, but the curse has finally gone quiet. There are no heirs left to carry it, no thrones to fight over, no bloodline to protect, just peace, or something that looks a lot like it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the mercy she never found in life. The dynasty that ruled half the world now exists mostly in archives and museums. Their portraits hang in silence. Their jewels sit behind glass. Their grand titles, Archduke, Electress, Emperor, now belong to the dead. All the power in the world, undone by a belief in purity. It's poetic in a grim sort of way. Because after all the coronations, all the weddings, all the golden lies told in candlelight, the mighty Habsburg legacy ends here. Not in triumph, not in tragedy, but in quiet. The curse ends in silence. And now, finally, they can all rest. Preferably somewhere with a doctor. And that is where her story ends. Maria Antonia of Austria, born royal, lived sick, and died young. And somehow, that's still the best outcome anyone in her family ever had. She entered the world as the embodiment of dynastic perfection and left it as proof that perfection is usually fatal. She was the last verse of a long, sad hymn, one that began with kings, popes, and empires, and ended in a quiet crypt beneath Vienna. And if you've stayed with me all this time, I'm mildly impressed. You've just survived 3 centuries of royal genetic malpractice. Most of her relatives couldn't even make it past their 20s. But maybe that's what makes her story strangely peaceful. She didn't start wars. She didn't seize power. She didn't live long enough to ruin anyone else's life. She just carried the curse until it stopped with her, like someone quietly closing the door after a very long, very strange family dinner. So as the fire crackles low and the cathedral bells echo faintly in the distance, remember her not for her bloodline, but for her endurance. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't make it into textbooks or statues, but somehow lingers, like candle smoke or memory. And maybe, as you drift off tonight, you'll dream of those marble halls, empty now, the portraits asleep, the candles burned down to stubs. Maybe you'll hear the soft hush of the snow outside Vienna, falling endlessly over the graves of people who finally ran out of ambition. Because if there's one thing Maria Antonia's life taught us, it's this. Nothing pure ever survives. Not bloodlines, not empires, not perfection. Only stories. And this one, the story of a princess who inherited too much of everything, is finally at rest. Subscribe if you love what I do here, or you'll never come across this channel again. That's not a threat. That's the YouTube algorithm, and it's crueler than any royal curse. So go on, close your eyes. Let the history fade into quiet. Sleep well. May your family tree be messy, unroyal, and genetically diverse. And if you're still awake, thank you for being part of this little corner of the internet where history whispers instead of shouts. You make it possible for me to keep telling these stories, one long sleepless century at a time. Good night.